Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is John Mazzulla, one of the 3 student body presidents here at CU Boulder, and I will be serving as today's moderator. Now, before we get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional homelands and ancestral territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, and consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. Once again, welcome to the Conference of World Affairs and today's discussion. We ask that all of our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. We also ask you to please silence your phones. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and a producer will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, then raise your hand when you have completed the card, and a producer will collect it and return it to me. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I remind our audience that the full speaker bios are found online at the Conference of World Affairs website. We will begin with Charlotte Clymer.
Thank you, Ms. Maslet. Appreciate that. Folks, it's such an honor to be here. This is my first year at the Conference of World Affairs, and I gotta say, the surroundings are absolutely disgusting. I hate walking out of the hotel every morning and getting fresh air to breathe and looking at the God-shaped mountains. It's really, really quite terrible. So thank you for being such gracious hosts. I'm honored to join my fellow panelists today. These are just tremendous professionals, and I'm really excited to talk about this particular subject. I will admit to you, I do not really consider myself a journalist. Maybe I'm going through a bit of an identity crisis over the last few years in terms of what it means to be a journalist, because I've always thought that it means someone who tells the pertinent truths that the public needs to hear. But when I was growing up, I worshipped journalists, Helen Thomas and Dan Rather and all these other folks in the White House Press Corps and the Pentagon Press Corps and really people who spoke truth to power. And I always looked at it as a formal process of going through an internship and joining a newsroom and really being held to a high editorial process of standards that ensures that you're making sure that you do the due diligence of getting information out to the public. And now here I find myself as an opinion writer, writing about foreign policy and politics and religion and culture, and really just saying whatever the hell I want to on a daily basis, not answering to an editor, not going through a formal process of ensuring that everything that I say with outside parties is necessarily fact-checked or edited in an appropriate way. So it's a strange time for me to be in the role, whether or not I kind of find myself as that way, as a journalist. And I'm really grateful for the ability to write about the news and write about politics and all these other topics that matter to me. But right now in DC, there is a substantial debate over the role of journalists versus content creators. And there are a lot of journalists who I think are understandably concerned about the, I would say, lack of allegiance to facts that we see in content creators across the political spectrum. But at the same time, I would argue, with all due respect, that content creators wouldn't exist if there weren't an audience for them. And the reason there's an audience for them is that over the past few decades, we have seen a rapid decline in the standards of legacy media. There are so many journalists working in legacy media whom I deeply respect. Many of them are friends and colleagues, and they do incredible work to inform the public. But at the same time, I am old enough to remember when legacy media led us into a disastrous, irresponsible war in Iraq, when they failed to hold accountable banking executives who brought on the 2008 Great Recession, when they failed time and time again to hold those in power accountable, when they have created a destructive double standard between how Donald Trump is held accountable versus every other person in power. We are in the situation in no small part due to the reluctance of legacy media to hold themselves to a high standard. So now we are in this very awkward situation in which we have many journalists in legacy media who are doing the work that needs to be done, but many of their colleagues are not. And their audience needs to crave that truth from somewhere, so they come to content creators. So I'm really excited to talk about what it means to be a journalist in these days and all the nuances that are involved in that, and hopefully help you all leave this discussion with a better understanding of the topic overall. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte. Karine Hajar.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karine Hajar. I'm an editorial board member at The Washington Post, where I write editorials and do op-eds. Before that, I was a columnist at the Boston Globe, where I gave a largely conservative perspective for an audience that wasn't largely conservative. And that was really fun and had a great time at the Globe. I did a fellowship at the Wall Street Journal opinion page before that. And I've had my own independent blog on religion and travel. And I think Charlotte really touched on the lack of trust in mainstream media. I'm a bit of an odd duck because, one, I'm in opinion. I do a lot of reported work, but under the opinion side. But two, because not a lot of young conservatives tend to gravitate towards major media institutions like the ones I've been in. And I guess my message is that I'm really optimistic. I think that there is a real marketplace of ideas out there, and people just have to get out there and engage with it. I don't think these places are irredeemable. I'm very optimistic about the media landscape. So I'm really glad to be here, really glad to talk about it. But that being said, yes, people are gravitating towards content creators because at least the last time I looked at this Gallup poll, the national media has less trust than even Congress, which is rather depressing. And so I think that's a great kick in the butt for legacy media to look around and say, what should we be doing? And at the Washington Post, we're really trying to make some changes and move in the right direction.
Thank you, Karine. Jazel Noor.
Hi, I'm Jazel Noor. I've been a journalist my whole adult life, and now I work at Solutions Journalism Network. How many people here have heard of Solutions Journalism? Okay, we got some hands. Great. So the idea behind Solutions Journalism is that in order for the media to tell the whole story, it needs to not only inform the public about what's going wrong, but also tell the credible stories of where things are going right, like rigorous reporting on responses to social issues. And so I work with newsrooms around the country to help tell those stories, to help bring that framework into their work. a lot of journalists, most journalists are very well intentioned, but as we've sort of touched upon, there's been some practices that have eroded trust, and journalism is in a period where it needs to, it's making a corrective. So the newsrooms I work with are doing less horse race coverage, less focus on who's ahead and polls and pundits, and actually taking the time to go speak to people in their community, ask them what their top priorities are, and then what the biggest challenges they face, and then do reporting about who's doing it better, right? And so all that to say that whether you're a content creator, whether you're a journalist, I think something that the media can do a lot better is to tell those stories about what's working and how that change happened. One of the newsrooms we're working with in Lafayette, Louisiana, a couple years ago, they have a huge housing crisis there, and I know that's the same thing here, right? But the local elected officials were never asked about housing. So because it's largely controlled on a state level, right? There's state policies that set housing, there's federal policies, but the media hadn't really reported that out, and so it left the politicians off the hook about addressing housing. So they surveyed young people to ask them what the top reason was that young people were leaving Lafayette. It was housing. So they created election coverage around that issue. They did a reverse town hall. Regular town hall, the candidates get to speak. In the reverse town hall, the people got to speak and be heard out by the politicians, who then got a chance to respond. Then they created a voting guide based on housing, so people could make informed decisions. All that to say, I think the media can really be more engaged in helping people make informed decisions, show them how change has happened, and it's also our responsibility to also seek that out and understand who's providing us that critical information. And almost all the journalists I talk to say their biggest challenge is funding. They don't have enough money. So, there's a lot of worthy news outlets out there that, deserve your support.
Thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. I'm going to start us with a grounding question. How has the journalism landscape shifted within the past 10 years?
I'll start. A lot of what I was consuming, I guess, in early college and high school, at least the format of it, is now the format that I'm being told to do the news in, or I think all of us are sort of being told to do the news in. These videos, these short clips. This is how people my age are genuinely consuming their news. And I think that the knee-jerk reaction initially was, oh, that's probably not right. We don't like that. We want people reading our content. And by all means, I would love for people to read more, but this is just the reality of where the news environment is going. And so it's been really fun getting to adapt to that. And I'll just give an example. When I did my first internship at National Review, I would have been just out there writing, maybe taking some pictures, doing a lot of reporting and analysis. But now I do the same type of coverage. I'll give the most recent example. I went up to Maine for the Democratic primary in for the Senate race, and I did what I usually do. I go around, I talk to people, I interview candidates, I write an op-ed, a reported op-ed off of it. But I also got to take footage and come back and sit and do a vertical video. And different people consumed each product, and that's really fascinating. And so I think the way that things have changed is that I think even by generation, people are consuming their news differently, and that's just a reality that we need to come to and adapt to.
Yeah, that's well said. I'd say that there is a celebrity culture that's overtaken legacy media that really disturbs me. It used to be that to be a celebrity journalist, you would break some really big scoops. You would develop a reputation for straight shooting. I'm thinking of Dan Rather. I'm thinking of Walter Cronkite, Connie Chung. These were titans of journalism because they did the work. And people saw they did the work and they trusted them. And now social media has completely warped the idea of what it means to the fact that I'm even saying build a brand within journalism feels a little icky to me. It feels as though Right now, there is a double standard in reporting on Trump versus other lawmakers. And this primarily comes from, I think, the tension in that. Let me give an example. 2 years ago, after President Biden's disastrous debate with Donald Trump, all of July of 2024, it felt like the whole of legacy media just piled on to President Biden. They nitpicked every single public appearance he made, every single statement he made. They looked for any single reason to accuse him of suffering from dementia, cognitive health, what have you. And I'm fine with that, because that's the role of journalists. It may have made me uncomfortable, may have pissed me off a bit, but that's the role of journalists. Fast forward to today. In the past week, Donald Trump has threatened nuclear war against Iran. He has threatened the genocide of 93 million Iranians. He has publicly attacked the Pope. He has posted a picture of himself depicting himself as Jesus Christ. And somehow, none of this has been greeted with a flood of op-eds calling for him to resign. It has been greeted with cable news panels calling on him to resign, for the 25th Amendment to be invoked. There is just such a clear double standard. And I'll tell you the reason for it. Maybe part of it is because of death threats and maybe the threat of violence against journalists for speaking the truth. But a lot of it is because of brand protection. It's because a lot of journalists, not all, but a lot of journalists in legacy media don't want to lose out on that book deal or that network news gig or that invite to a particular cocktail party. This upcoming week, next week, is going to be the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and thousands of journalists will attend it with Donald Trump in attendance, even though he is credibly accused of raping children, even though he is holding back 3.5 million documents that would put a lot of powerful people into some dire straits because of their connection to a massive sex trafficking operation, even though his administration has barred journalists from the Oval Office, from the White House press briefing room, from the Pentagon press briefing room, even though he has publicly slandered journalists while their colleagues did nothing to fight back in response. I mean, Donald Trump is the greatest threat to the First Amendment in modern history. Where is the outcry from legacy media? Where is it? I don't know. But I'll tell you this much, if President Biden had done one of these things, there would have been an immediate call for apologies. There would have been a growing effort to get him to resign. I mean, there is such a disparity in coverage right now, and it's mainly based on journalists not wanting to lose their social and political capital, not wanting to lose it on opportunities. And that is a prime example of how legacy media has drastically changed over the last 10 years.
Charlotte, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What did you think about legacy media coverage of Trump in his first administration?
That's a great question. It was much better. It was much, much better. I think that the fact that we saw a number of resignations from his cabinet, well, I know there were recent resignations of Kristi Noem and whatnot, but I mean, gosh, in the first 9 months of his first term, there were a number of resignations that happened because of solid reporting and really pushing back against Trump during press gaggles. We saw much more pushback against Trump during his first term than we see now. I mean, it's like night and day. If we had that right now, I would feel at least content. I would feel at least happy with the effort. But we don't even have that. And honestly, the first term, it wasn't where it needs to be. Look at UK media versus US media. A UK reporter would not dream of holding back and pushing against a lawmaker in power because it might lose them some kind of capital with parties. It's a blood sport. Political media in the United Kingdom is a blood sport, and here it feels more like brand building and everything surrounding brand building and everything surrounding the personal networks that each journalist and lawmaker has.
I want to slightly push back on Trump not being held accountable in this administration. Now, I agree that there have been threats to the First Amendment under this administration, absolutely. I think we share some similar concerns. I'm on record wanting to abolish the FCC. I think that it's a political cudgel, and that it can be weaponized by either side. I don't think we need it anymore. We're not consuming our news off of 3 radio stations. But a lot of the first admin coverage of Trump was, it was zealous, people were on it all the time, and that didn't stop him from being reelected again. And so I think that people are taking a different approach now and dealing with basically the merits of what he's saying, and a lot of times that calls for criticism. A lot of what we do is a lot of what I do in my day-to-day job is take issue by issue, and we've been I'll just use tariffs as an example. We've been very critical of the president's economic management under this administration, and so I just think that the coverage is different, and I think a lot of people are pushing back against the president when he does the wrong thing, and it just is different than the first admin. It's a different flavor.
It is a different flavor. And again, I think there are legacy reporters who are doing a great job. Yourself included, by the way. I am not attacking Corinne, just to be clear.
Yeah, I didn't feel that.
But it is embarrassing to watch a reporter in the Oval Office get a bullshit answer from the President of the United States and not say to his face, "Sir, you're misleading." That is completely the opposite of what's happening in reality. And this happens on a constant basis. And to ignore that is to allow the degradation of American democracy. Reporters should be bloodthirsty. They should want to get to the truth no matter the cost. That should have always been true. But what Donald Trump has exploited is the weaknesses in legacy media that have existed for decades to his own ends in a way that any of his predecessors have done. The first term of Trump was better, but now it feels like it's just absent. I mean, where's the fire? There's no fire from legacy media right now in pushing back against his litany of irresponsible, disastrous, unconstitutional actions and remarks. And it concerns me beyond imagination. I wish that I would feel a lot better about American democracy if we had a legacy media, even if they disagreed with me on my particular political take. Just challenge these people. Just make sure that you're in the room holding them accountable on the facts. Don't ask a question and then lie to you, have them lie to you, and then not ask a follow-up. Why am I watching Meet the Press and watching the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, on Meet the Press, lie to Margaret Brennan's face, excuse me, that's Face the Nation, but any of these Sunday shows, lie to the anchor's face, and then not have that kind of pushback? That embarrasses me as an American. I wonder what everyone else around the world is thinking as they watch this. I should shut up because I'm taking a lot of space, and Mr. Noor needs to speak too.
So I kind of have a different kind of thought process about this. I think the debate we're having is great, but my work doesn't really focus on that, on what you're talking about. But what I like to think about is how we are really deliberate about the food we eat, right? And we think about what's healthy, what a healthy amount is, what healthy foods are, and when we get in trouble if we eat our favorite foods, right? Like your husband's gonna yell at you, your wife's gonna yell at you, your doctor's gonna yell at you, right? And I think we need to be thinking about that about media as well. One of the greatest threats we face right now is what neuroscientists call learned helplessness. And that's the idea that if you only hear things that are going wrong, then you start to believe that nothing can be done about it. So I think we have to be really intentional about balancing how much we hear about this spectacle, this coverage of politics, and also make sure we have time to connect to our communities, right? Are we staying involved? Are we spending as much time as we are scrolling through our phones as we're actually talking to our neighbors? And I've done some reporting in Baltimore, in my neighborhood, about how when Trump's immigration crackdown came to Baltimore, people got offline and they went door to door and met their neighbors. They used non-digital ways of communication. They made zines and flyers, and they use that because they know that a lot of social media is compromised or surveils you. So I think I think while the media plays a really important role, content creators play a really important role, as consumers, we need to be like really thinking about what our diet looks like and how to make sure we're balancing and meeting our needs to be informed and to understand what our agency is.
Absolutely.
I'll be quick, I promise. No, Mr. Noor makes a great point, because it isn't just on media or folks in the public square, it's also on readership or viewership to do the right thing in challenging what they're reading and what they're watching. I did a test last year. Do y'all remember the whole controversy over Sydney Sweeney appearing in the jeans ad, what have you? All right, so I published this piece, and the headline was, "Why We Need to Cancel Sydney Sweeney." But you go into the piece, you click on it, and the very first line in my piece was, actually, I have no problem at Sydney Sweeney at all, but here's some things you should know about. And I wrote like a list of headlines, because I had a feeling that a lot of people seeing the article posted online, they wouldn't even click on it. They would just go off the headline. And this is what a lot of consumers do. And I will admit to you, there have been times when I've seen a headline and I've done the same thing, so I'm not above this, but we've gotten to the point where we are lazy. We just want to imbibe a headline we see on social media instead of reading what that writer or that reporter or whomever is trying to say. Because the number of emails I got across the board from people who read just the headline and said, "How dare I want to cancel Sydney Sweeney?" And then I would send them a response saying, "Did you read the article?" And they would send me back an email saying, "Well, you should have said that in the headline. It shouldn't have been, I mean, we're not helpless. We're not helpless, and we kind of do embrace this learned helplessness where we kind of act like victims as consumers, and we're not. We're grown-ass adults. And we have a responsibility to think for ourselves and use common sense and interrogate things that may not seem all as they are on the surface."
Thank you very much to all the panelists. One of the through lines that I heard through opening discussion and then that conversation was the declining trust in media. So what has caused the declining trust in public media, and what corrections does the field need to do in order to regain the public trust?
I think we've touched on a lot of the factors, but I'll just focus on one. I think that it's undeniable that mainstream media had a bent to the left, and that was ostracizing a lot of Americans. I covered the 2024 election. I was on the campaign trail on the GOP side from the beginning, like New Hampshire beginning all the way through. And the problem, at least when people complain about media coverage, sometimes you'd have people just complaining about articles because they didn't like what it said, and that's not fair. If an article's factual, it's factual. It's more what it didn't cover. It's more what major papers weren't talking about. And so I think for at least like legacy and mainstream media to regain trust, national media to regain trust, it's going to take more balance. It's going to take bringing people into the newsroom that think differently. And in my own experience, if you're a young conservative and you want to get into journalism, you go straight to opinion. And I'm guilty of that. I did that, albeit in sort of different institutions than usual, but that's what I did. And if you're a young liberal and you want to go into media, usually you become a reporter. And I think it would be great to have a mix on both sides, and have people come in and being committed to objectivity, but covering their stories, covering them truthfully, and offering their different lenses of the world in that space. And so that's just one thing that I've been thinking a lot about. I'm very optimistic. At the Post, there have been a lot of changes on the opinion side, and we talk a lot about free markets and personal liberties, and I don't think that there can be enough conversations about these ideals. And so that's just a new layer of competition and thinking in the marketplace.
I think so. Obviously, it's a very complicated. There's many different answers, and there's different ways to approach it. One way I like to think about it is that, and if any of you have immigrant parents, you can relate to this, because if your dad only tells you the things you do wrong, you're going to have a very screwed up sense of yourself and your role in the world, right? And that's kind of what the media tends to do. And so that's really where solutions journalism comes in, because to be a solution, to do solutions journalism, you don't only show up at a community's worst moment, you show up when things are going right. And those are not the stories the media tends to tell. And so I think just showing up and meeting people where they are. And the other thing I'll say quickly is that journalists are not good at explaining what they do, what their editorial process is, who writes for the editorial page, is that reported? What is the difference between reporting and, opinion and editorial, right? What are your, one thing we work on with our partner Trusting News, which is a journalism support organization, is to have every newsroom set out a mission statement and take questions about it and then write a Q&A. So really try to explain what you do. And I think that the lack of transparency, or just assuming people know what goes into the news, is misplaced, is wrong. And I think that's something that, as content creators become the top, the leading source of news for young people. I think that's something that content creators can do too. Like, what is your approach? What is your methodology? What perspective? So I'm an immigrant, and I make that very, I don't put that in every story, but I'm very open about that, and that's my own, and I still report on immigration and how it's affecting my community, but I try to be transparent, and I think showing up, being transparent, those are all things that journalists can do.
Thank you very much for that. We've received a couple questions from the audience that talk about financing of media. So what role does financing play on the legacy of media, and does it support branding, or does it change the way that viewers are seeing the media?
I mean, Jeff Bezos. With respect to my wonderful colleague who does great work, the Post is a shadow of its former self. It just is. And the person to blame for that is Jeff Bezos. When he bought the Post, when was it, 2015, 2014? I forget, 2014. I think a lot of us were hopeful because the Post is such a grand institution with an enormously illustrious history of great reporting. I think second most in Pulitzer Prizes, one over time, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just an incredible institution. So when he stepped in to make it into an even better institution, I was hopeful. I think a lot of us were. But then we fast forward to 2024, when he clearly spiked the Post's endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris, and then made up a bullshit excuse for why he was doing it. And when internal staff tried to push back against that, they were ignored. And then we saw a huge exodus of people from the Post. Look at the New York Times, all the leaks that have come out of their newsroom meetings, in which the leadership of the New York Times have admitted that they probably skirt around the truth because they don't want to appear as too biased in favor of facts, whether it's trans people, whether it's the economy, whether it's any number of things that affect not just the American public in general, but marginalized communities specifically. I think that the erosion of trust has not been an oblique thing. It's been a very direct assault on the American discourse, on how we view each other, on how we view issues that should not be partisan. They should be rather common sense if we're engaging in good faith. And so, ownership has really, really deteriorated American media, especially over the past 10 to 15 years. And it's not getting better, quite frankly.
I guess that's my cue to respond. So regarding the owner of the Post, these are his words. He's been clear that he is a complexifier. But I think on endorsements in particular, it's important to note there has been conversation about the timing, and you brought up the response to that. But it is important to note that I think 3/4 of major papers, I think this is according to the Neiman Lab, don't quote me, but don't do endorsements. So a lot of major papers don't do endorsements. So I just want to note that. Certainly, again, complexifier, but trust in media has been eroding for a long time. Like when you look at that Gallup poll, it transcends just whatever billionaire owns whatever paper. A lot of wealthy people own papers and for a long time have owned papers. And so I think that a lot of the changes, Bezos wrote an op-ed about explaining some of the changes happening at the Post. I think it was in either 2024 or 2025, and I invite people to check that out. I think it really does touch on some of the bigger distrust that is in the space. This is not just because of who owns a paper. This is because of the content of the paper, how they're choosing to cover and what they're choosing to cover. And so I'm really excited about the new work that we're doing at the opinion page, because we really are trying to add another voice into the marketplace of opinions, particularly. And we just don't think there can be enough debate about free markets and personal liberties and the tremendous opportunities in this country. So a lot is changing, but again, I sound like a broken record. I'm really optimistic.
Yeah, I think media consolidation is a trend that is concerning when just a handful of corporations control most of the mass media. But I think an answer to that is people contributing to news outlets that you trust, and that that is the biggest challenge for newsrooms is funding. So if you put your money where your mouth is, if there's a news outlet you support, if you agree with their mission that they articulate by using the best practices of transparency and trust building, then depending on how much you can chip in, like give a few bucks or give more if you can. And get your neighbors and friends too. I think there's a growing trend and content creators, influencers do the same thing, right? They crowdsource that funding. It's not like a sustainable long-term model. The same way you don't want to. I worked at a news organization that had one benefactor, and they could pull that rug out at any minute, right? That's not sustainable. And I think we have to really think about what those sustainable models look like. I think there's states that are passing legislation to help fund. I think Maryland, I just learned here that Maryland, where I live, passed a measure to help fund local media through tax dollars. So there's a lot of innovation and a lot of people working on this, but yeah, support the media that you care about.
And I will say it's tough because sponsors do, whether or not they feel they might, they do direct messaging just by sponsoring the paper. I started my blog 5 years ago. It's called Charlotte's Web Thoughts. It's on Substack, and I have no paywalls. It's free to read, free to subscribe, and I get emails from people saying I had to unsubscribe because I didn't agree with your opinion on this. I'm like, oh, okay, go with God. It's great. That's fair. It's your money, and if you don't agree with what I'm saying and you don't want to support it, that's totally fair. But I will say that it's worked. I'm completely honest in what I say. I have turned down numerous sponsorships that I didn't necessarily agree with. I have turned down third-party folks not third political party, but outside groups who wanted to sponsor particular blogs or wanted me to endorse an app or something like that would harvest emails. And I said no, because that's not why people are subscribing to my blog. They're subscribing to get some sense, some angle on what's happening right now. So, I would encourage folks out there to understand that there are a lot of people in both legacy media and content creators who are trying to do the right thing, who don't want to be bought and sold by the highest bidder. A great example of this, the Minneapolis Tribune, a legacy newspaper that I think has been doing a fabulous job over the last year in reporting on the actions of ICE and the Trump administration in Minnesota. The week that Alex Preddy was shot and killed by ICE agents, I bought a subscription immediately to the Tribune. I never read it, by the way. But I'm not going to cancel my subscription, because when it came to informing their community without varnish, they stepped up. They did something that was courageous. Their journalists went out to the community. They got opinions that were not liberal at all, were quite conservative, and some that were liberal, and some that were in the middle. But they did the work of informing their communities, regardless of the subscription fallout. That's what we need to be encouraging right now.
Awesome. And with that, I want to shift us to online and independent journalism. What value has online and independent journalists added to the journalism field, and how do we protect consumers from inaccurate information?
Well, I'll just say generally online and content creators have, in a lot of ways, forced us to sharpen ourselves, and we're trying to catch up in some ways. I think a lot of the vertical video and also video streaming format, that's something that big newspapers and big newsrooms are coming around to now, and folks have already been doing that just independently. And so we're trying to do that backed by the institution and backed by the credibility and the work that the institution is doing, and I think that's really important for trust. But style tips, we are looking at these content creators. I'm really excited. We've been working on a video podcast called Make It Make Sense. It will launch in the next month or so, but it's already being posted, but you can see the clips online. We're pulling clips from the videos and the conversations, and these are techniques that frankly already exist outside of major institutions. So yeah, definitely pushing us to sharpen. I think it's really important when consuming, this is one of the amazing things about this country is you can consume what you want to consume, and you can believe what you want to believe and say what you want to say. But that should come with the responsibility. People should. I think it's just good democratic hygiene to read widely, to challenge yourself every day, so that when you do see something, and you're not exactly sure where it's coming from, or if it just happens to confirm your gut reaction, really check yourself and think, well, is this just, and this is never popular, because it's never popular to tell readers or viewers, I guess, to do something differently. But I really think it's actually incredibly civically important to not only adults modeling for their children, teachers modeling for their students, read things that you disagree with every day, so that when you do come across a video that is AI slop, you can scratch your head and say, maybe that's not true. Maybe just because that sounds nice, it's not the real thing. So that's my rant over.
I'll build off that AI question. Obviously, we've seen an uptick in AI use in media. So how do viewers discern AI information, especially as media literacy has become less taught in schools? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been a lot of criticism of how the right wing consumes AI content. I don't think the left wing is any better. I think, 3-4 weeks ago, there was that whole conspiracy theory, it was a month ago, Benjamin Netanyahu being killed in an airstrike. And this went super viral for several days. And it was mostly pushed by dipshit content creators who did not do research, who were trying to monetize off of people who, are opposed to Mr. Netanyahu and wanted to, find someone who was willing to tell them what they wanted to hear. It was disgusting. This went on for, 3 or 4 days of just all these conspiracy theories surrounding the false murder of Benjamin Netanyahu. And it was propagated a lot by AI content, by taking a screenshot of one of Benjamin Netanyahu's press conferences. What was the biggest one? Saying that he had 6 fingers on one hand. Which was clearly AI generated. Here's the crazy thing. This went viral mostly on Twitter. And at the time, if you took your happy ass over to Benjamin Netanyahu's Twitter account, you could watch the entire video in which there was no appearance of him having 6 fingers on one hand. But people did not want to do the work. They wanted to be lazy. They wanted to hear people tell them what they wanted to hear. And, it's one of these things where, folks, there's no magic bullet to fighting back against AI as a consumer. But the biggest accelerant is your own laziness. It's being aware that AI content is there to validate your biases, your pre-existing biases. So if you see something that seems too good to be true, maybe it's time to take 30 seconds or a minute just to look it up. If I see an article that tells me that some politician is about to resign over a sex scandal on Twitter, I'm going to go look it up on Google and see what other sources have been reporting that, if any. I'm going to challenge it. I'm going to make sure that I know what I'm looking at. That's the only way we fight back against AI. There's not going to be a mommy and daddy in legacy media who hold our hands and tell us what's AI and what's not AI.
Beautiful. So we were talking a little bit about guardrails for independent media. If you could come up with guardrails or guidelines around ethical and responsible journalism for content creators, what would those look like?
I mean, I would hope that you would try to hold yourself to the same standard of reporting verified truth. We know that that often doesn't happen, and that goes for the media as well, right? The media is guilty of that as well. But I think just sticking to that core mission, and also like I said, like being transparent, trying to help people understand what your sources are, where you're getting this information. And just try to, journalists need to earn that trust, and I think content creators do too. I think they can use a lot of the same practices.
I guess when talking to, and this is mostly directed at younger content creators who haven't had time reporting, some of the best advice I ever got, and again, my first internship was at National Review. I did an editorial internship, so it was technically opinion, but I remember my boss at the time, or my manager at the time, saying, nobody cares what you think. You're, however old I was, 18, 19. And so report it. Make people care what you think. And that was the best advice I've gotten in journalism. It continues to be a core part of what I do. I like to, if I'm writing an opinion piece, I must report it. In fact, I prefer going out and talking to people and infusing interviews and on the ground experiences rather than just doing more of an armchair analysis. And so I get worried now that I see people my age doing commentary and they've never actually reported. And that really scares me. And on top of that, look, again, I think we've talked about a lot of the flaws that I think are getting better in mainstream media. But one of the great things about these institutions always has been good is that you have layers of editors. They're older than you, they're more experienced, and they're going to call out your bullshit. And that's been great for me. I needed somebody older to tell me, one, how to be a better writer, but two, you aren't responding to this argument. You are missing this fact. And if you're going out and making a career based on your entertainment value, well, you're not having like those really critical checks. And so that really worries me. That's not to say that there aren't people who do it well and who do it in good faith. There certainly are. But I think a lot of people in my generation are missing like the really formative years of reporting training.
Yeah, that's really well said. That's really well said, actually. And what deeply concerns me about a lot of independent media and many content creators is the lack of political knowledge that they come to the table with. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a content creator say, let's just do the 25th Amendment. Why don't they do the 25th Amendment? Without knowing that that's initiated by the presidential cabinet. It's not Congress. I mean, Congress is part of it, but it's not initiated by Congress. And they say, well, why don't they impeach? Well, that takes 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House. And, you know, you gotta make sure that you do it in the appropriate way. And, you know, it's a lack of institutional knowledge that really sets a number of content creators behind. And it's fine if you're talking about something that you do know. But if you're talking about something you don't know, like, for example, if I do an article on, let's say, the plumbing industry, I'm going to do the research to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate. Sometimes I might say something that's not totally accurate, and if that's the case, I'll just be honest about it. Hey, I messed this up. Here's the actual knowledge about it, just so you know. And the other thing, too, be honest about your biases. Be honest. Don't try to hide your biases. If you are of a particular political persuasion, just be honest about that. I wrote a piece last year about Arlington National Cemetery, 2 years ago, about Arlington National Cemetery when there was that whole incident between Trump's campaign staff and a cemetery official, and I was very honest in the piece, like, hey, look, I'm a Democrat, but this isn't about party. It's about respect for those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for us. Just be honest about it. I would also say the same thing to legacy journalists. Be honest about your biases. I don't think there's any such thing as a journalist without biases. I don't. That we continue to pretend that there is such a thing as a journalist without biases, I think is part of the reason why we've gotten here, is because readers and viewers don't know what they can trust. They don't know if Amna Nawaz on PBS, whom I deeply respect, who's a dear friend of mine, we don't know if she's telling the truth on any particular story because I might be viewing it through a particular lens. And if she's saying something that makes me uncomfortable, or if she's saying something that makes me happy without knowing her biases, how do I trust it, right? We need to get better at communicating our biases like adults. And I think that if we encourage content creators and journalists to be more honest about that, we'll get closer to where we need to be in terms of that media hygiene that she so eloquently talked about.
Awesome. With the world getting a little smaller every day, why would U.S. consumers view U.S. foreign correspondents when they could go directly to media sources that are global? With the world getting a little smaller every day, why would U.S. consumers view U.S. foreign correspondents when they could go directly to media sources that are global?
I think, like with a lot of media, it comes down to, we're talking a lot about trust and personalities. That's becoming a much bigger thing, like the brand of the individual. But still, the brand of an institution matters, and people gravitate towards certain brands based on their biases. And so I think that's probably a part of it, but I don't have a great answer to the question.
I'll just disclose that these days I hardly follow the news, and I deleted my Twitter. I'm not really online at all, unless I'm reporting a story or I need to know, or I just need to be informed about, general world events. But when I would try to, if I was trying to learn what's happening on the other side of the planet, I would look at a variety of news sources, and if you can find, and understand what those biases are of these outlets. We're talking about foreign policy. Mainstream media tends to take one particular viewpoint. And the viewpoint on the ground in Iran is probably going to be really different, right? The viewpoint on the ground in Palestine is probably going to be really different. And so I think it's important to get a wide, and not even between countries, but also I come from independent media. So I know most people watch mainstream media, but I would say also check out some independent media are covering the topic too in the US, and see what the differences are and try to make your own decision about where the truth kind of lies.
Well, I will say this. I think that we have some exceptional U.S. journalists who cover foreign policy. At the Post, at the New York Times, at USA Today, at the AP. I mean, we do have some really great American bred journalists who do foreign policy coverage the right way. I do think that a lot gets lost, though, and that comes from the lack of investment in foreign policy coverage on the ground in these hot spots. Not to beat up on the New York Times yet again, but we had this whole fiasco, what was it, a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, where the international section of the New York Times posted this headline that said, "What is the North American Treaty Organization without America?" It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it wasn't a typo. It wasn't. I can understand typos. I make typos all the time in my writing. It was this editor, and it wasn't the reporter, to be clear, because editors choose the headlines, it's not the reporters. It was this editor actually believing that NATO, this international organization that has been at the center of world and really domestic politics here for the last 4 or 5 years, they actually thought it stood for North American Treaty Organization. And the reason they wrote that is because they wanted to play on words with it. Well, what is it without America? This is the international section of the New York Times. That embarrassed me as an American.
That sounds like a mistake AI could have introduced in
Yes,
it too.
It does actually. But it was deeply embarrassing because we're already criticized as Americans for having a very US-centric worldview on foreign policy. And then we have the New York Times, which is supposed to be like the vanguard of exceptional foreign policy coverage, making this very rookie mistake that was based on trying to be pithy instead of trying to be accurate. So, it's one of these things where I can understand why a lot of international readers would look at American foreign policy coverage and be a little hesitant to take what we say without a grain of salt.
How should individuals combat mis- and disinformation coming directly from their government and elected officials?
Yeah, I think we've all been talking about finding your trusted news outlets and your sources or trusted messengers in your community. Governments lie. That's what they've always done. Like, don't assume what they are saying is true. And we know that too many media outlets or even influencers tend to just regurgitate press releases or talking points. So be skeptical. You have to be skeptical with everything you consume and understand every person and every outlet has their own bias and their own agenda. And yet, don't just rely on the government to tell you the truth. Like, that's silly.
I think, yes. I think a lot of times, or especially throughout the Trump era, it's really easy to just say, Trump's a liar, we don't trust him, don't listen to him. And again, that approach, Trump was reelected a second time. And so I think one way to really hone in on just when you don't trust what is coming out of the White House is doing so issue by issue. Because there are some things that the president has done that people like and are good and are true. That's just the truth. There is a lot that isn't. And so I think that media gets credibility by going issue by issue and doing the hard work of calling things out detail by detail. And that's certainly something that we try our best to do.
They cover those angles brilliantly. So I'll just reiterate what I said before, is that, just because it helps Democratic talking points does not make it reliable information. Just because it's a reporter knocking Trump or Vance, although 100% of the time, usually Vance is in the wrong, but it is what it is. But just because it's a newspaper or an outlet that is saying something that aligns with my worldview on Trump and foreign policy or what have you, doesn't make it right. And so if I see a headline or coverage that is critical of Trump, but there's a little niggle in the back of my mind that says, I don't know if this is exactly accurate, I'll go look it up. And sometimes it's not accurate. There is nuance there. And it turns out that criticizing Trump on this particular point is wrong. It does put me in a false area. So as consumers, it's really, really important. Just look for a second opinion. Look for secondary coverage. Look for corroboration from other sources on what you're reading. I know it takes a little more time out of the day. I know that we have 9-to-5s and kids and things to worry about, but it is on us to at least make sure that we're making an effort to further validate what we're reading. That's good for us. If you don't care about news media or politicians at all, do it for yourself. Do it so that you can walk into any conversation and beyond any shadow of a doubt that what you're about to say is backed up and that it's credible, it's accurate.
Going back, yeah, that was great. And just going back to the media diet, I think it's really important for us to understand how what we consume influences how we see the world. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned journalists that cover crime in their community, but most people don't know what the crime rate is in their community. In Baltimore, crime is a top issue. It's, we've all seen The Wire, probably, right? Most people in Baltimore don't know that violent crime is down 40%, because you wouldn't know that by watching the news. So it's important to understand that the influence that has, and that we need to combat that. We need to be aware and to combat that, to really understand reality and to really understand what's happening around. And for me, part of that discovery was realizing that how the media covered Baltimore is not the city I lived in, right? It's not the world I lived in. And that's also what got me into solutions journalism, because that is the balance, right? What is this community doing right, or what can it learn from another community? And that's exactly what happened in Baltimore. We learned from best practices in violence intervention around the country, and that made a huge impact. And so telling those stories also fights disinformation. Same thing with election security, right? People are susceptible to conspiracy theories and disinformation around elections because they don't know what makes them secure. They don't know how those systems actually work. When there are people that are not registered to vote or have died, how their names get off the ballot. And that's some great reporting that we should seek out and share, as trusted messengers in your community. That's something you can do, is make sure people are getting that information as well.
What is the new role that independent journalists play in protecting the First Amendment?
Well, sometimes testing it. No, I mean, again, actually, it's funny. I was doing a panel about the 250th anniversary recently, and was just reading about the history of media in our country to prepare. And, we had quite a rambunctious early press corps. It did not, when you think about the freedom of the press, it wasn't the freedom of the New York Times or the freedom of the Washington Post. It was the freedom of whoever wanted to go out and publish a pamphlet, it was the freedom of Thomas Paine to say whatever he wanted. And so in a lot of ways, we think about, this feels like a really new and scary time. In some ways it is. In some ways, our country's gone through this before. People have independent Substacks. That's very much like the pamphlet of common sense in my mind. Maybe things are moving a little slower or a little faster than before, but I think just I challenge folks to think about. I know that this is probably a question that's more about the First Amendment broadly, but if we're talking about the freedom of the press, we really need to. We've talked about the standards that we'd like to see from content creators, from independent journalists. That's all true, but I also think it's really important, and what makes this country great is that people have the freedom to go out there and say what they want, and the onus is on the media to do a good job, on the legacy media to continue to offer really high quality reporting and commentary. But again, to both of your excellent points, it's also on the consumers to know what they're consuming. And you have the freedom to read what you want. Just make sure that whatever you take away from it, it's on you to make sure you're taking the right thing away from it.
So I was an organizer with the group called U.S. Democracy Day. I don't know if anyone heard of it, probably not. But basically the idea was to mark the International Day of Democracy, which is September 15th, I think. And so to mark that, to encourage media outlets to publish one pro-democracy article or op-ed or whatever, just to acknowledge that, because I think and so it started off really small, but the final year, 350 news outlets, big and small, participated in that. And I think there's a growing realization that historically, media has been expected to be unbiased or objective, and I think there's an understanding among a growing amount of media outlets, especially independent outlets, that you can't be, you have to take a side on the issue of the First Amendment, right? Being pro-democracy is understanding that our ability to report as journalists comes from that First Amendment, and you can't be neutral in that question, right? You have to take a stance, and I think independent media does that really well. Not all independent media, it's not all created equally, of course, and I think there's a growing recognition in mainstream media and legacy media of that as well.
Yeah, everything to what Ms. Ajar and Mr. Noor said, but what I would also say is that, independent journalists have a responsibility to understand the First Amendment and what it does. The First Amendment exists to protect you from punishment by the government. That's its whole purpose. It does not protect you from private consequences. The First Amendment does not allow you to slander people without consequences. It does not allow you to spread disinformation without consequences. It does not obligate people to pay you or to agree with you or to allow you to say whatever the hell you want. If there's a content creator who says something libelous or slanderous toward a public figure and they get called out on it or they get sued, too bad, babe. That's how it works. You said something that was inaccurate about someone in public, and now you're facing the consequences for it. That's not protected by the First Amendment. That should be protected by your internal editorial process, whatever that may be. So independent journalists have a great responsibility in showing what the First Amendment can do, but also they have a great responsibility in abiding by an understanding of the First Amendment and educating the public about the First Amendment and understanding that there's a difference between the First Amendment and the concept of free speech. There is a free market of ideas, but part of that free market means that you negotiate the consequences of what you're putting out into the world, regardless of what those consequences are. Even if you're right, even if what you say is stridently accurate and it needs to be said, that does not mean that people are obligated to give you their dollars or their attention or their space or their time. It's very important that we maintain that principle.
How do individuals know if they are exercising a balanced media diet? And how can individuals seek out reputable media sources from opposing sides?
You should be cringing when you're challenging yourself. I actually talked to, when we were talking to the group of college students who are aspiring journalists yesterday, it was really fun. And I gave an example. I said, if you're very liberal, I challenge you to read National Review once a day. Just read one editorial or one piece from National Review. And obviously vice versa, And so I think if you're doing it right, you'll know.
I'll just make a plug for my my employer by saying that Solutions Journalism Network has over 17,000 vetted solution stories on their website. So when you're reading about a problem happening somewhere, you can look up what solutions look like. What are verified solutions that have taken place and been published in news articles around the world. And there's no silver bullets out there, right? But a small town in Colorado might have reduced homelessness by 20% by offering more wraparound services, right? There's so many different examples of places that are getting it right and making, moving the needle. And I think it's really helpful to sort of balance that. And like I was saying, understand the impact. The leading cause of news avoidance is that it makes us depressed and it has an impact on your mental health. And as someone that followed the news religiously for a dozen years, I can tell you that my mental health improved dramatically when I could just be offline. It was pretty amazing.
There's a very easy test for understanding or self-assessing whether or not you have a balanced media diet. It's just the question you have to ask yourself: when was the last time you read something in good faith and it made you uncomfortable? Whether it's books or newspapers or opinion writers or what have you, or content creation for that matter. I read things all the time in outlets that people are surprised by. I read the Daily Wire every now and then. I think it's a propaganda outlet. I think it's unabashedly a propaganda outlet. But I still read articles every now and then there because I want to see what the other side is saying. I want to see their way of thinking. And even if I think it's made in bad faith, I need to know what people are seeing when they read it. What is that organization? Media Matters. Media Matters does an extraordinary job of monitoring media across the spectrum. And they really are just adept at scrutinizing media from various sources, fact-checking. Dan Diamond, I think, does a great job of doing the same thing, looking at media that may not necessarily align with what all of us agree on. But if you're only reading things that make you uncomfortable, if you're only reading things that make you comfortable, you're doing a bad job as a citizen. If you don't read things that make you uncomfortable, how are you going to talk to other people who hold opinions that are different from yours? That's really what it comes down to. Advanced citizenship means the responsibility to talk to people who disagree with you. And it means understanding where they're coming from and what they're reading and what, they may misalign with you on.
I'll add one thing to that. I spent and continue to spend a lot of time reporting on higher education And I graduated in 2021 when I was an undergrad, and I had a column about just how difficult it was to have open conversations on campus, especially if you were outside of the political vogue. And I think like since then, we've seen obviously a lot of protest movement on campus, a clear sign of like the degradation of discourse on campus. People can't talk to each other. And the big problem was that a lot of students had this idea that the feeling of discomfort, to your point, was violence or was dangerous. And I think that's really damning for institutions of higher education, but I also think that crept into major companies. I think that crept into a lot of our workplaces and then into our communities, into our families, that having uncomfortable conversations was like an act of violence against the other person. And so I really hope that, I've seen like a lot of progress, especially in the higher ed space. People are really trying to make a difference, and I think seeing the problem, and we've seen some really hopeful stuff, but we're not there yet. And if being uncomfortable, like this idea of safetyism, if being uncomfortable is equated with violence, then I think there needs to be some soul searching.
Awesome. We have time for just one last question. What excites you most about the future of the journalism field?
It's easy for me. It's journalists like Ms. Hajar, who are doing some great work in legacy media and really transforming the problems or taking a good effort at fixing the existing weaknesses. I will say, you've made the best argument for subscribing to the Washington Post I've heard in the past 2 years. So
Someone call up my boss, my editor.
yes, well done. Yes, clap for her. Well done on that. But really, it's all these young journalists who are coming into the field, looking at the myriad of problems out there, and instead of quitting, instead of saying, well, this is too hard, they see it as a leadership opportunity. They see it as an opportunity for making us a stronger country with a stronger information public space, with seeing it as an opportunity to ensure that Americans are are empowered in the information that we consume. So that's what gives me hope.
Well, one, that's very kind. And I wouldn't be on an editorial board that believes in free markets and personal liberties if I didn't say that I'm really excited about the competition in this space, and I really mean it. And we've been talking about different types of media, and the type of media that both of my fellow panelists are doing, the type of media that content creators are doing, just like the Substack ecosystem in general. We are having to sharpen each other. It's not just competition between the major papers anymore. We are trying to make like high quality content backed by, of course, the trust of the institution, but we're making vertical videos the same way that anyone on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok is making vertical videos. And so, and we're trying to, newsletters have exploded in popularity. And I think that in a lot of ways is like trying to chase the Substack economy. And so I'm really, obviously, your competitors are your competitors, but we all make each other better. And so the work that both major papers are doing, but also independent journalists are doing, is forcing us to do a better job. And so that's why I'm really optimistic.
So I want to share some of the things that the newsrooms I've been working with have been doing. And we've given them $4,000 in training and support, which is also valuable, but with not much money. The Minnesota Women's Press used the grant to work with 10 college and high school students to do first-person solutions reporting on what laws they were working on in the state capitol, everything from like immigration to housing to homelessness. KALW, which is public radio in the Bay Area, they used the money to create, to do a youth-focused town hall, invited 50 young people from around the Bay Area, and they're following them for the rest of the year and building election coverage around them and their stories and what they think their communities need to thrive. If you're in my last panel, you heard about Gulf States Newsroom. They're doing reporting on the construction of the biggest AI center in the entire country, happening in rural Louisiana. They use that money to go out there. It's like costs like $500 per trip for housing and stuff. And they learned that the state prevents local residents from monitoring air quality if that's going to be used to evaluate the impacts of a construction site. So they worked in true partnership with the community and used the rest of the grant money to buy air monitors and gave that to dozens of residents. And because they're using that to pursue journalism, that work is protected from that state law. And so we found a way to get them more money to continue that reporting. And that's just like a small example. That's just like what I pulled up on my phone. So all these newsrooms that are really committed to working in partnership with their community, really listening, building trust, and helping communities solve their biggest challenges, that's what really inspires me. And that's actually inspired me to do more reporting in my community, because I don't see that in Baltimore. Even when I'm really burnt out and don't have enough time in the day, like I'm motivated to help tell those stories too.
Awesome. Thank you very much for our panelists for being here today, and thank you to the audience, both in person and online, for your attention to this issue. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the Conference of World Affairs.
And thank you to our